You're listening to the Behind the Cover podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Shure, the premier choice for affordable, durable, and exceptional sounding microphones. With almost a century of microphone design legacy, Shure is committed to delivering immersive sound experiences that resonate with professionals and enthusiasts alike. Whether it's audio production, podcasting, live performances, conferencing, or any form of content creation, Shure is your go-to brand for high-stakes moments, offering reliability and excellence in sound. We are about to read a piece of Australian music history. So I'm holding in my hands the October 1985 print magazine of Rolling Stone Australia with Michael Hutchence of INXS on the cover. So this was 12 years before his tragic death on November 22, 1997. That was the day that we lost a music icon and one of the most charismatic and commanding live performers I think Australia's ever had. He was this huge talent with a larger-than-life legacy that I think we still feel today. And that's why this piece, this time capsule from almost 40 years ago, is so momentous. I read it before I sat down, and I just love how the writer, Toby Creswell, he captures the impact that INXS already had on culture at this point. So Toby knew Michael very, very well. He actually wrote a biography about him in 2017 called Shine Like It Does, The Life of Michael Hutchence. And we are lucky enough to have him in the studio with us today, and we'll have a chat with him later. For now, though, here is the 1985 Rolling Stone Australia cover story on Michael Hutchence and INXS. Albury-Wodonga is, as the locals keep insisting, a border town. Sitting astride the Murray River between New South Wales and Victoria, Albury-Wodonga owes much of its prosperity to the Whitlam government, which designated it a regional growth centre back in the early 70s. There is a definite sense of specialness, a new frontier about the town, a metropolis in microcosm in the middle of nowhere. Albury-Wodonga reminds Michael Hutchence of other border towns. He stares out of the Travelodge window and talks of seeing Mexicans running towards the US border. The hills have that same khaki colour, the sparseness, not arid but not particularly fertile. It's the border ethic that's really pervasive, though. That sense of slight disconnectedness. Here we are in the Australian bush and everyone is talking about New York, London, Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, Paris. INXS are about to cross a sort of border of their own, a kind of launch into the Twilight Zone. Their 5th album has just been completed using English producer Chris Thomas, and with an all-up cost that informed sources place around the $500,000 mark. The band is embarking on a world tour that will take them to 4 continents. And if all goes according to plan, they'll be on the road for the next 9 months. 9 months that they hope will see their transformation from the ranks of the contenders into the major league. Right now, however, the band is in Albury on the final dates of an Australian country tour, warming up for the stadiums and the concert halls. INXS have covered this territory for 7 years, playing every bar or hall that would have them, from the Queensland deep north to the mining towns of Western Australia's Pilbara. It's this extensive playing in front of audiences that has bound the group together and made them one hell of a live band. In Australia, bands have a lot of experience playing live, says Hutchence. You throw yourself up against popular opinion instead of sitting in the studio writing a song and getting $50 a week from the record company. I think playing live is a very good thing for a band, though it's starting to disappear here, just as it has overseas. These days, record companies are signing bands for lots of money in big-budget videos. Personally, I don't like the result. INXS's strength has always been its sense of community. 6 people with equal input making loud music together. It's a gang mentality that mixes up John Farris's interest in funk with Tim Farris's tough rock tastes and the swing jazz that Kirk Pengilly listens to. Given that 3 of the band are brothers, and that they have all been playing in INXS since they were teenagers, the group has a healthy collective subconscious. There has also been a genuine adventurousness. The flip side to their singles, for example, have usually been group experiments while pushing their own limits, while the A-sides are aimed directly at the top 40. The 2 previous albums, Shaboo Shabaa and The Swing, were both records that made the most of layered textures and studio technology, moody, elusive, emotive records. The current album, Listen Like Thieves, however, is very much in the classic rock and roll spirit. The textures are still there and the dynamics are still there, but the emphasis is on the power drive. We decided to write the album in a rehearsal situation, says Hutchence. Everybody had ideas in their heads, but not many of the songs were written before we rehearsed, and we wrote one song in the studio. It wasn't the kind of album where you put each track down bit by bit. We've done the album like a live show, and what is there is there. We want to present this record as a band, the idea of 6 people playing together and using traditional sounds. With the current technology and production, with some of the records I hear on the radio, there's literally nobody there, just a producer and an AMS. I can't think of more than 6 bands over the last 2 years who have been big anywhere in the world. It's all solos and duos. It's going back to Tin Pan Alley when you have songwriters going straight to producers. INXS's notion of a band is more like a collective. The group has stuck together for 7 years, including a period where they all moved to Perth together. The band accommodates individual talents and allows for their expression, despite the fact that most of the songs are written by Hutchence and Andrew Farriss. For example, the flip side of the current single was written and produced by John Farriss, while Andrew Farriss has done some outside production work. Hutchence is considering a role in Richard Lowenstein's next drama called Dogs in Space, and Kirk Pengilly has involved himself in projects like the studio ska band The Igniters. Andrew and I may write most of the songs, but this is a real band, says Hutchence. It's not 2 writers and 4 dumb musicians. It's a very active, competitive, democratic group of people. None of us take a low profile, and that's very important. We're a band that sounds very much like a band. Chris Thomas may be well known for his work with Elton John, but it was his production of the Sex Pistols and the Pretenders which had most in common with Listen Like Thieves. That common denominator is inventive, emotive, and solid rock and roll. The way Chris works is to get you to play it, and he won't talk about it, says Hutchence. He'll turn it up loud and play it back to you. Any mistakes and the worth or otherwise of a song becomes painfully clear. He listens at full volume 90% of the time, though I don't think he's completely deaf yet. It does get embarrassing, like when he does the final mixing at Air Studios. He'll open up the door and turn up the monitors and sit back and wait to see if anybody will come in and ask about it. In going for a rock approach rather than the electronic emphasis of the past 2 albums, INXS found new strengths within the group, particularly in Tim Farriss, whose guitar work had long been subsumed in the rhythm. The sheer size of the sound on Listen Like Thieves gives the band a different shape and an exuberance that wasn't evident before. I was just thinking the other day how our album seems to go in cycles, says Hutchence. Shaboo Shabaa was a very emotional record. The swing was, by our standards, pretty political. Musically, it was an album where I think crossed somewhere between left and right and met in the middle, and that's what I think INXS is in some ways. Listen Like Thieves is like saying, let's have fun, saying it really simply, and who cares if there's no hidden meaning? While Michael Hutchence discusses the recording of Listen Like Thieves, next door in room 316, the INXS Global Headquarters has set up temporary office. Chris Murphy, INXS's manager, is manning phones and calling meetings. While INXS certainly deserved their full due for the music on their records, Murphy can take a lot of credit for the sales, and for the fact that the last INXS single debuted in the national charts at number 5, higher than any previous Australian record. Murphy was born in the business. His father started the MMA agency, and Chris moved into the family business, taking over INXS after years of working through booking agencies. He signed the group to the independent Deluxe label in the late 70s, and when that went sour, he took them to WA Records as an independent production distributed through WEA. Murphy and the band have maintained their control over the market and their public image, and they have used considerable foresight in planning their long-term career moves, as demonstrated by their first trip to the United States over 2 years ago, well before the band had hit there. The plan was to break in the international territories as they were peaking there. This is the stage now, explains Hutchence, where you're in a corner in Australia. That's why we went overseas before we got to this stage, so we don't feel like there's a gun to our heads, that we'd better get big overseas right now or we'll die in Australia. We've always been ambitious. We're not floundering towards the next gig, but I've always considered us to be very natural. If we are just a pop group, which I don't think we are for 1 minute, then we're a very natural one. It's not showtime, boys. It's not putting on this trip for world domination. It's just not that mercenary. That's not what I got into music for, celebrity or whatever. Stardom and success are two different, though connected, phenomena. Success comes from Chris Murphy and the band's highly accessible music. The stardom comes from Hutchence himself. He has the ego and the self-consciousness. For example, throughout this particular afternoon in Albury Wodonga, there was a crowd of teenagers gathered at the front of the hotel, and screams would go up every time there was a glimpse of one of the band. Every so often a cry of "Michael!" would reach up to the third floor, and eventually Hutchence responded and went down to meet the kids. He came back with a list of names for the half dozen who weren't able to get tickets to the show. In private life, Hutchence is quietly spoken, educated, and funny. Then, as showtime approaches and the band is dressing, one can see him change. He gets a little more withdrawn and a little more tense. The energy level goes up, and there is a glint in his eyes. Similarly, after the gig, in the town's one late-night bar, the promoter is throwing around bottles of champagne, and as he gets drunker, Hutchence gets a looking for trouble look in his eye. As soon as I got out of school, I nosedived into the underground, he said earlier in the day. I wanted to see the other side of life. I guess it's a romantic notion, but I find it really good for me. I really like going to places where nobody cares about you or knows who you are. It's great for the soul. I've had a cycle of going in and out of the cliched rock and roll lifestyle, and I'm not interested in the sex, drugs, and rock and roll way of living. Lately, I've taken a turn in my life, and I've stopped indulging myself in other people. At this stage, I could go either of two ways. I could go out the old traditional rock and roll way, or take a sort of perspective. I hope that's what I'll do. The rock and roll star is not something that is simply a product of the music, but rather a creation of a new self. Just as Elvis Presley created a self-image for the public based on solid gold Cadillacs, or Pete Townsend created a self for the public based on his adolescent perception of himself as misunderstood teenage mod, so it is true that Michael Hutchence, and to a lesser degree the whole of INXS, have created a special image of themselves. While it is somewhat more subtle and complex than those of Presley or Townsend, it is very definitely there in the clothes and the poses they adopt on stage, while it's largely Hutchence's love of trouble that gives the band its high public profile. Hutchence can muster up that sense of danger that goes with rock and roll from Mick Jagger to Nick Cave. He gives the melodic INXS an edge. But it's only on stage that the real power of the group becomes apparent. Tonight, in a broken-down country cinema, INXS prove what a consummate band they really are. The set opens with the Swing, the title track of the 5 times platinum album. The kick drum powers it off with double beat. John Farris pounding the beat with his feet while he holds the drumsticks aloft in gloved hands. Tim Farris plays the guitar in leather and chrome, and he doubles on bass to beef up the bottom end, while Kirk Pengilly looks more than slightly eccentric as he pulls off guitar lines like a consummate professional. And in the background, Andrew Farris plays guitar amidst a stack of high-tech keyboards. Across the stage, Gary Beers is silent, incognito behind an unstoppable beat. Out front is Hutchence, lurking around the stage under his familiar greatcoat, with his characteristic obscure grace incorporating high kicks and grasping at straws. His charismatic presence is undeniable. To see INXS on stage is to see one of the last great rock and roll bands, a celebration of physicality and aesthetics. It's incredible that a bunch of friends should end up such good players. Never thrown anyone out, never needed help, Hutchence had said. The worst thing that could happen to us is for divisions to develop within the band. We could split off into 3 separate bands tomorrow, but we fight strenuously to keep together. So far, there have been no major rifts, and we still get on really well. We know each other so well. I find that rather frightening. Toby Creswell, thank you so much for coming on the Behind the Cover podcast. We have just read your piece from 1985, where you sat with Michael Hutchence in a hotel room, and then you went to the show, and then it seems like you hung out with them after, the whole band INXS. This was almost 40 years ago.
Right, yikes.
Yeah. Do you remember much of this experience?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a life-changing moment for me because I'd been writing for the magazine for a while on a freelance sort of basis, and in 85, just around the time that I did that story, Paul Gardner and Jane Matheson, who published the magazine, and edited it, invited me to come on as a full-time employee, as a music editor. So it was a big thing because Paul and Jane, I guess as well, had decided to embrace Australian music. And, Rolling Stone had been going for a long time, since 72 in Australia, and there'd only been one Australian cover, which was Skyhooks. And there'd also been a Men at Work cover on US Rolling Stone, which we ran here. But basically there'd been very little Australian feature stories or input into the magazine. And so Paul kind of thought, I'll take a chance on Michael Hutchence. The band and Warner's, the record company, were very keen to do this because INXS were just on the verge of breaking. They had the Listen Like Thieves album with What You Need on it. And so a Rolling Stone cover was something that could actually break the band internationally. In those days, before the internet, everything was very, very kind of hands-on. And it was very hard for people overseas to understand how big a band was in Australia. So the one sort of thing that would make it work, the one kind of piece of currency, was the Rolling Stone cover. So it was kind of important for them to make that happen. So we had a situation where Warner's and INXS and the management really wanted it to happen. Paul was kind of wanted it to happen, but also was concerned about the risk, because it was a very big risk as far as he and Jane were concerned. And anyway, we managed to get it to happen.
So you were freelancing at the time.
Yeah.
And what kind of publications were you working for outside of Rolling Stone?
I did my first piece for Rolling Stone in 1977, I think, which was a review of Jojo Zepp and the Falcons. And
you remember your first review?
Absolutely.
You know what? Me too, because mine was North Lane, like the first North Lane record, and I remember I was only 127 words, and I remember going, "How the heck am I going to tell the story of this record in 127 words?" Yeah, you're right. You do remember your first.
Yeah, so I used to send stuff off in the middle of the night, and they occasionally published them. So I started then, in about 1980, I started being more serious about it as a kind of career and started wanting to write a lot. And I did a lot of work for Rolling Stone. That was a magazine that I was really very committed to, from issue 100, which was the first Australian issue in 72. So anyway, 1980, I started writing for them a lot, and it was a really good time because Australian music was really kind of coming into its own. The records were kind of selling enough now that record labels were starting to invest in Australian music, and bands were kind of getting big. The Angels, Cold Chisel, INXS, Metals Anything, blah blah blah.
You're very good at capturing culture and what's happening at the time in your pieces. So in this piece, the band had released Shaboo Shabaa, the swing was already out as well, and there was obviously this huge buzz around INXS. And then in your piece you show that you're in the hotel and there's these kids downstairs screaming that can be heard from the room, huge fans of the show that are wanting tickets basically, and that captures the height of the INXS fandom in that moment too.
I'd never seen anything like that kind of teen thing. Like, it was like we were 5 floors up and they was kind of screaming, and occasionally Michael would go to the window and open the curtains, and they would just scream more, and we'd sit back down and talk about the cave.
When you were walking out, did the kids rush you? Did they want to talk to you because you'd been inside?
They had no idea who I was. The only thing they were interested in was INXS, and particularly Michael.
See, nowadays they would, because of the internet and Twitter and being able to source who you are, they would be able to work out you're the music editor for Rolling Stone Australia. They would know that you would be there, and they would probably rush you going to your car or your way out.
Yeah, maybe. It was kind of weird though too, because I remember getting the assignment from Rolling Stone. I didn't have a phone, so everything had to be kind of coordinated, but on a red payphone on the corner outside the corner shop.
So you get to this area and then you use the red payphone to call Chris Murphy or something.
Oh, when I was I was assigned the story, and then I had to negotiate with all the organisation of the story and stuff, and talk to the magazine from the, one of those red payphones. You probably have no idea what they look like, but
I know what a payphone looks like. So were you? So you would write some of the piece, and then to talk to your editor, you'd go down to the payphone and talk through it.
Yeah, and how you got it to how you were going to logistically. I was going to get to Albury and get back again, and all that kind of stuff. It was all just kind of done on a public phone. How
did you get to Albury?
I can't remember who paid for it, whether it was Warner's or the magazine. I suspect it was Warner's, and on an aeroplane.
You flew there. Was that you'd flown in a plane before?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Okay. It wasn't like the first trip.
No.
Gotcha. And in that, you're in this room with Michael Hutchence, and you mentioned that next door is kind of like this INXS global headquarters with Chris Murphy on the phones. And I just wondered, what was it like dealing with Chris Murphy? Because obviously we lost him in 2021, larger than life character in many ways. Was he very much hands-on in your interview process, your researching process, post-interview? What was he like to deal with?
Chris was very hands-on about stuff, and he had an incredibly good team at MMA at the time, and he had a great offsider, Gary Grant. So they were all really smart, really connected, really committed people. Everyone was kind of, you could feel that everyone was on board this project to get INXS to the top of the American charts. They'd been going for some years, and Chris had a vision. He had his map of every day in his 3-year plan, and he was just, pursuing it. And it was kind of amazing to behold it because, Chris was a kind of next level guy. Australian music in the 70s and 80s, it was really, from my perspective, it seemed to be the people who were running the thing were the managers. And there were a bunch of alpha male managers who were kind of dictating how the industry would develop and who was going to make it and how it was going to go. And they had much more clout, I think, than the record companies or radio or anybody else. And Chris was really, an alpha male amongst the alpha males.
And what was he like in dealings with you around the piece?
We got on incredibly well for a long time, and there was a lot of mutual respect. We eventually, the next time we did a Michael Hutchence cover, we had a bit of an argument about that, and we didn't get on after that. So at this point, we were very good friends. And, he was kind of trying to make sure that the Gardeners went with the thing. They obviously would like the band, but that was not going to happen. It was going to be Michael solo. And I remember, going back and forth because the Rolling Stone offices were in neutral bay, and about a kilometre away from the MMA offices, which were down by the water. So we were kind of going back and forth, and with pictures and kind of deals, and trying to, just kind of make it happen. Really, there was a lot of people committed to it going to head, and it really changed the magazine. This cover, because it did really well, kind of confirmed, Paul and Jane's commitment towards Australian music, and it really changed after that.
Thank goodness. We almost have you and Michael Hutchence to thank for a focus on local music, which is a big thing that we have.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of like Australian music in those days was not nearly as popular as it is now, and so it was kind of seen as Australian music was seen as a kind of a death knell for a cover, and so this was a really real turning point.
Do you think it was because of bands like Cold Chisel who were like, we don't really need to export the band, we don't really need to tour overseas endlessly, we're just going to be the biggest and best rock band in Australia?
That was part of it. I think also what Murphy really learned something from Cold Chisel, because Cold Chisel sort of did 3 albums, and then on their 3rd album they started getting releases in America and starting to tour. But by that stage, the band had been going for 10 years and they were tired, and they had kind of nice houses at home or nice, lives here, and didn't want to kind of get in the van and just tour America. So Murphy sort of took INXS to America very, very early in their career, and even before there was any interest in them. And then they started playing in a bar in San Francisco. I can't remember the bar, which was the first gig. And then they just toured for years and years and years and built it up that way. So, you know, that was kind of the difference as well. And I think those guys' sort of vision and the willingness of people like Paul to get behind Australian music really, you know, did make a difference in the 80s.
Now, you mentioned before you had a bit of a tiff with Chris Murphy, which inspired him to never talk to you again. And I would love for us to sit down and do a full podcast chat about that Michael Hutchence cover. But just in case I can't get a hold of that magazine, would you tell the story of the Michael Hutchence cover from the 90s, which led to Chris Murphy being really upset with you?
Yeah. Well, so INXS, you know, were huge with Kick. And Michael, I think, was, you know, he wanted to kind of get beyond INXS, I think, in some ways. He didn't want to leave the band, and he wouldn't leave them, but he did want to try other things. And he went and did this record called Max Q, which some people have probably heard about, and certainly Hutchence fans would know about it. And yeah, it was a great album. But and he did it with Ollie Olsen from Melbourne, and it was kind of around about the film Dogs in Space, around about that time. And so he's got this record, and I thought it was a great record, and I thought, well, you know, there's a lot of people who want to know about what Michael Hutchence is doing. So we thought, we'll put him on the cover. And then we realised that Chris Murphy didn't like the Max Q record. He didn't want the Max Q record to happen. He didn't like that it was happening because he didn't want to break up INXS. He thought he had a good formula with Michael and Andrew Farris, and let's just leave it at that. So he tried to bury the Max Q record. He didn't put it out on Warner Brothers, who had the other INXS records. He specifically didn't do that, and he made sure that there was no promotion as much as he could. So managers in those days particularly used to kind of control photography, and they would, you know, people would have to sign releases, and they were pretty tight on the releases around Michael. And so every photographer that we tried to find to get a picture for the cover wouldn't sell them to us.
Wow, because Chris had already gotten in there.
Well, Chris had basically, yeah, he'd controlled all of the photographs. There was another magazine at the time called The Edge, which was being edited by a friend of mine called Clinton Walker, and we were both trying to get a Michael Hutchence cover. And I would just sit up all night calling magazines all around the world trying to find somebody who had a photograph. And eventually, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I found somebody in England who was an agent who had photos and didn't have a release form that's signed by Murphy. So it was great. It was a great headshot of Michael. And so I said, yeah, can I have the photos? And they said, sure. I said, where are they? And they said, oh, they're down the road. And Smash Hits magazine had got the pictures. So I went down the road the first thing the next morning and met this girl, Lisa Anthony, who was editing Smash Hits, and she just handed over the pictures, and we became friends. And Clinton never talked to me again, and neither did Chris Murphy. But you know, I thought it was important. A great record, and Michael was happy.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to burn a bridge, just make sure you don't need it again.
Well, yeah, it caused a few problems over the years, but it's all right.
Yeah. Would you do it again?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was kind of really, you know, I liked Michael Hutchence as an artist, and I kind of liked him. You know, we were kind of acquaintances, I suppose. So I thought it was important to publicise his work. And I thought our readers want to know about it as well. So, you know, Murphy managed to jump through all of these kind of hoops. Like, we have to get avant-garde artists to do, you know, pictures of Michael and all this kind of stuff. And it was all just shit. But it worked out in the end. It was kind of fun.
I love that. And I love going a bit rogue with Rolling Stone. I think that's the publication where you can do it.
Well, I think so. I think, you know, it's And of course, INXS had this other issue with Rolling Stone in America, because Kick album came out sort of midway through the tour, the American tour. The Americans wanted to put INXS on the cover, and they wanted to put Michael on the cover of American Rolling Stone. And Chris kept going, no, it has to be the band, it has to be the band. And, you know, while he was a big shot in Australia, he wasn't such a big shot in the United States. And so Jan Wenner and the magazine just said, okay, well, if we can't get Michael, we'll have Terence Trent D'Arby. And so that was the end of INXS's possibility of getting an American cover.
Oh, and it burnt the bridge that way. Interesting. I love this feature because you go from the hotel room to the live show to this only late night pub that's open as well. What do you remember about that night? And was there anything that you couldn't put in due to word count or whatever, or perhaps defamation maybe, that you wish that you could have put in the piece?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was very green, so I was pretty kind of not intimidated, but I was pretty green about it around the guild. So there wasn't anything that contentious. I mean, I sort of liked INXS, and sort of wasn't that impressed really. And then I went to that show, and I remember being backstage, which was sort of like an old semi-trailer backed up against the town hall, whatever it was in. And they were kind of doing a sort of Spinal Tap impersonation before going on stage, you know, kind of hitting the walls and stuff like in Spinal Tap. And then I just went into the room, and the show started with the swing with Johnny Farris on the drums, just doing this incredible, massive, kind of huge kind of beat. And that kind of converted me after that.
I love that you remember that.
Yeah.
That moment. It's very clear that you...
It was only 40 years ago.
I don't know. I mean, I look at articles I did 5 years ago, and I sometimes struggle to remember the moments. But what's beautiful is you can read it back, and it conjures all the memories, which I love. There's also this very interesting moment where Michael Hutchence seems to think about his own legacy and his mortality. And there's a line, I'd love to read it to you. He says, "At this stage, I could go either of two ways. I could go out the old traditional rock and roll way, or take a sort of perspective. I hope that's what I'll do."
Right.
What does that conjure up when I read that back to you, knowing that he passed? Yeah.
Well, I the thing that surprised me most in the interview was, I didn't really know that much about Michael, but he wanted to talk as much about Nick Cave and the Hunters and Collectors as he did about the band, you know, and he sort of implied that he would really like to be in the Bad Seeds.
Okay.
So there was always that kind of side to him as well, and I think, you know, he was interested in blues, and he was interested in kind of bohemian avant-garde stuff, as well as like loving pop music and obviously and dance music and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I thought that was kind of interesting kind of character, and it didn't come out in the music, you know. It was something that was sort of hidden, but in retrospect, that was the road he was going to go down, you know. Because around about this time, he did Dogs in Space, that film where he plays...
You allude to it in the piece, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. He plays a sort of junkie rock star, and, you know, I think that was kind of the beginning of the way out, you know, the beginning of the end in a way. Like
an omen?
Well, kind of. I think, you know, I don't really, you know, I'm not in a position to know, you know, really pontificate much about what made Michael Hutchence fall off the twig like that. But, you know, he did have that, he had those two sides to him, you know. There was one side that was kind of serious about his art, serious about his work, really loved things of beauty. And there was another side of him that was kind of dark and self-destructive. And I think, you know, and I think the bicycle accident and the head trauma and stuff probably pushed him in a direction that you couldn't have foreseen. But there was always that kind of, he always liked the dark side.
You allude to the dark side in this, actually. You say, as he gets drunker, Hutchence gets a looking for trouble look in his eye.
Yeah, I think Michael had caused, a lot of trouble in his day. I mean, I didn't see any evidence of it at that point, but, subsequently it became obvious. He was a hedonist. He really he was very interested in sex and drugs. And, the INXS were a big party band. Of all of the groups of the 80s, INXS and MMA always had the best parties.
And you got to see one of them, like the after party, I guess, of the show.
Yeah, well, that was just there was like one pub that was open and the band was just crammed into it and the public was just crammed into it as well, and everybody was just drinking as fast as they possibly could.
Did you party that night, or were you thinking, no, I'm the journalist, I need to stay sober?
No, I wasn't thinking that. I was I was pretty pissed by the end of it, I think.
I love it. Yeah, you're involved. You're in it.
Yeah.
Do you remember? I mean, this is just such a terrible segue, and it's going from partying to something quite traumatic. But do you remember where you were when you found out Michael Hutchence had passed away? Tell me.
I'd just been at a wedding, and we came home, and the phone rang, and a friend of mine, Melissa, just rang up and said, "Michael is dead." It was pretty kind of weird, just kind of horrifying, really. I think I'd seen him a little bit before that, at the beginning of the tour, and he wasn't in terrific shape. And I think, a lot of stuff weighed on him.
Yeah, you almost felt there was an energy around him that hadn't been there when you first met him.
No. I mean, when I first met him, and for most of the time that I knew him, he was like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He was and also incredibly positive and incredibly nice about stuff. He wanted to kind of participate. Like, you would see him going out to nightclubs and stuff and kind of hanging in the corner and things. He didn't live in an ivory tower. He wanted to know what was going on. He would go and see, you'd see him at the Piccadilly Hotel watching the Deadly Hume and all that kind of stuff. He always wanted to know what the fuck was going on and be involved.
I feel like I can't sit across from you, who I see as a culture journalism legend, and not ask you about your thoughts on long-form journalism and where you think it's going and where you think it is now. Because obviously we at Rolling Stone still have a print magazine. We're quarterly, and we really believe in long-form and we believe in print journalism. But there's no denying a change in the attention economy.
Yeah. I think there's always going to be a place for long-form journalism, and good writing. Really, that's kind of that's how you get underneath things, and there are things that you can do with words on a page that you can't do any other way. So I think the short-form stuff, around the traps and the paparazzi stuff, can all be done much quicker on social media. But so I think really the only future for print is going to be long-form journalism, and that's why magazines like Rolling Stone have survived, and that's why a magazine like The New Yorker is very popular now in the way that it never was before, because people want that. They want that kind of quality. It's not going to be huge numbers of people. I don't think it ever was. I think probably people would buy Rolling Stone for the record reviews, and they would buy it for the news at the front and stuff. They wouldn't necessarily buy it for a 4,000 word rumination on INXS or cultures or something. They would. So I think it's just the mask has come off now, but there's always going to be a place for long form journalism.
That's a really good point. It was always for a niche audience.
Yeah.
It still is, but in order to get that true storytelling and dive deep into something and unpack the nuances of an impact on culture or a record or an artist's persona versus their actual persona behind closed doors, only a long form piece can do that.
I think so too, and I think, you know, everyone's talking about you know, robot writing and stuff.
Yeah, AI.
And I think that's sort of the end of those short pieces, but I think that's where inventive journalism is going to really come into its own. And I think it's harder now because you really have to kind of inspire people as well. You have to kind of grab them and intrigue them in a way that you didn't have to work as hard before.
Which makes you a better writer, right? You know, like I look at AI and how it's coming into journalism and I'm excited. I'm like, this is a great tool. Yeah. It is not a replacement for human creativity. No.
Well, we used to have to compete with, you know, like, you know, some students from UTS, but now we have to compete with robots who are much smarter. You know? So it's going to keep people on their toes.
Yeah, but I think any journalist out there that thinks that they're will be replaced by these robots, I think maybe they need to level up their own skill a bit, and be excited about the competition as well, because cream always rises to the top.
Yeah, I think so. And I think people will pay for it.
I feel like this isn't the last time you and I are going to sit together and unpack a Rolling Stone cover feature that you have done. And I'm really excited to have more of these chats with you. I think I have a few more in the office that I can dig out. But thank you so much, Toby, for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking. I hope it wasn't too boring.
Are you kidding? That was amazing.